Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight at RJ Julia. We're super pleased to be welcoming Sergio Troncoso in conversation with Jotham Burrello this evening to discuss the new work, Nobody's Pilgrims. I'm going to turn it over in a moment, but first I'm going to gush about the gentleman to my right, your left, who is, I have learned, a man of ambition who cannot be stopped. Some highlights include teaching fiction and nonfiction at the Yale Writers Workshop, which we've just been talking about. You can trace his impact across the Texas Institute of Letters. He has served as a judge for the Penn and Faulkner Award and has now published 8 works, the most recent of which is what has brought us here tonight. Now, I'm also going to gush about the book because I just finished it this afternoon and it was fantastic. It was expertly paced. It was somehow gritty yet heartwarming. There was a really interesting and sort of paradoxical balance that was struck throughout this book. It is a requiem for the American dream, I would say, and a very interesting mirror to hold up to modern society that is not at all times flattering, but as I found out getting to the end of this book, one of the nice things about mirrors is that they let the light in if you point them in the right direction. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the gentleman sitting behind me, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you to RJ Julia, the greatest bookstore in the state of Connecticut, or maybe one of the greatest bookstores in the state of Connecticut. Thank you for having us and hosting us. I'm Jotham, and this is Sergio, my friend. Nice to see you. Congratulations on the book.
I'm, very excited to be here. I love the bookstore, and I just had the best tuna sandwich I've ever had downstairs.
I seal it right here. I'm just kidding. Sergio, so for people who haven't read the book, I know you've been doing a little press for the book, so I've had an opportunity I've read the book and hear other people talk about it, but it's been said it's kind of a Huck Finn meets Contagion meets No Country for Old Men. Those are 3 books, and you kind of done a composite of these kind of things. What is your summary of the book? How do you describe what is Nobody's Pilgrim?
I think I would say it's 3 teenagers who are in search of their American dreams, and they steal a truck and start going across the country. Mm-hmm. And then there are these evil people who are after them and after the contraband that is hidden in the truck.
Right.
So that's sort of the elevator pitch, so to speak, of the novel. But really what it's about outsiders. It's about 2 of them are orphans, Tootie and Molly. And the third one is an undocumented immigrant, Arnuzco. And they really don't belong anywhere. They don't belong in their families. They don't belong where they are in their small towns. And they're really seeking connection with people, and they connect with each other. Yeah. So they start forming this family as they start their adventure. And so I think that's really one of the, I guess, main things in the book. But it's also, before I had any title, Nobody's Pilgrims, it was really just called my adventure novel. Yeah. Because I wanted sort of a suspense thrill ride, but for a purpose. And I wanted to put these outsiders through sort of a gauntlet of adventures and tough things that happen to them and things that they have to solve and get out of to form that community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's different from your other books just for that reason, I think. This notion of your intention to write the thriller, it moves at a great pace. We're on a road trip across the country, literally from Texas to Connecticut, where we sit today. Another thing, it seems to me, is this development of friendship between them. It starts out, it's very, tentative friendship. It's platonic friendship that might become romantic friendship if you read the book. But can you talk a little about this notion of young people making friends through the course of the novel?
Well, they're all 17 years old. And one of the reasons I chose 17-year-old protagonists, it's an adult fiction book, although the protagonists are 17-year-old. It's because I feel a lot of inspiration from young people. I have 2 boys, Aaron and Isaac. They're in their mid-20s now, but despite the problems that we've had in this country, whether it's presidential or COVID or whatever,
It's a long list.
Inflation, they have never given up on the dream of this country. And so for me, writing about these young protagonists was in part about that, was about young people who come from nowhere and are fighting for their American dreams. And they're also making friends on the fly. Our newsful meets Studi at a chicken farm in Texas, and they become fast friends. And then when our newsful gets a ride to go to Kansas City to take a truck in shipment of whatever it is that they're shipping to Kansas City, he gets a ride, and then at the last moment, because something tough happens to Studi at home, he decides to run away from home and hitch a ride with our newsboy. And that's really the beginning of the novel. But this friendship on the fly for me is a sort of an important concept, because I see that when we get older, and
Older.
Speak
for yourself, older.
but when you get old and crappy, I feel honestly that you start losing that openness to people, that you stop connecting with people. Like some of my best friends that I've made were made on the fly from the streets I grew up in, and they're still my friends 30, 40 years later. And you accepted them in a fundamental way that when you get older, you get a little more suspicious, you get a little more cautious, and maybe rightly so. But this way of making friends quickly on the fly, and then they become really tied together. That was important for me to see. And of course, as Studi and Arnulfo take off on this truck and they find out that the old man, Juanito, who is driving the truck, is really bearing contraband of some sort, because he gives a bribe.
That's what we can't tell anyone what that is. That's the big plot. Give
Right.
a spoiler there, but
Well,
and it's surprising.
yeah.
It is.
And it's still at the very beginning of the novel. Still the first 4 chapters. And so eventually, when Studi and Arnulfo are in the truck and they've gotten away from Juanito because they believe they're in danger.
Right.
They meet Molly, and again, their connection with Molly is immediate. They end up in the Mark Twain National Forest because they're hiding from the people who are pursuing them.
Right.
And they make sort of some stupid choices as they're looking at the truck and trying to find out if they're hiding in the forest, literally camping out, just not knowing what to do. Something happens and Molly saves them. And Molly is just working at a tackle shop at a little town in Steelville,
She brings
Missouri.
them lunch, if I recall.
Oh.
She brings them some food.
Yeah, she brings them food and she also helps them out. And again, they start with this connection. And a lot of this connection, I think certainly for Studi and Molly, and they're both 17-year-old, and Molly is the poor white girl from Steelville who wants to get out of town, is also through books. They're both readers. Studi, the reason he got off the highway at the Mark Twain National Forest when he's being pursued by these evil people is because he has in his crate that he brought from his house, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, among many other books. But he loves to read. And so that's why he said, stop here at the Mark Twain National Forest. And that's where they meet Molly. And then Molly, of course, that's one of her favorite authors. So they start talking and wordplay, and that's their connection. They're a little bit wary of each other at the beginning, but then they start connecting to words and through books and through stories.
And there's another very important book back there that he has leafed through 1,000 times, which gets them to Connecticut. It's not a giveaway. And that's really his motivation. And it's also, we always talk about our teachers, the value of our teachers, right?
Absolutely. Mrs. Garcia.
Mrs. Garcia got him the books and he promised to bring them back at the end of the summer.
Right.
Mrs. Garcia, he mails them maybe later. It's not going to happen right away. But talk about that special book that brought you to Connecticut. Because you were raised in Texas.
Right.
Now you live in Connecticut. You have a house in Kent.
Right.
And this kind of a straight line to there through this book.
Well, for Studi, the 17-year-old, he's very poor and he's an orphan and he's staying with his aunt and uncle who really don't want him there.
Yeah, that's an understatement.
And
yes.
Right. And how he escapes is by reading. And he has his librarian, Mrs. Garcia, at home that is feeding him books. You know, she's thrilled. She's found that this poor kid who loves to read. And one of the books he finds is Connecticut. And literally, it's like a pictorial book of Connecticut. And so he's just mesmerized by it because he's growing up in the desert and it's beautiful and green and has these white, beautiful steeples. And he imagines also one of his favorite shows, although he doesn't like to admit it, is Charlie Brown, and everything from the Thanksgiving special to the Christmas special. And that's what he imagined in his head before he'd ever been to Connecticut, before he'd ever been outside of the border.
Right.
He imagined that's what the home will be like. That's what his home will be, playing in the leaves and picking pumpkins and apples.
Right.
And so he had a very pastoral, idealistic view of Connecticut. And in many ways, the entire novel is and I've talked about this before in other interviews, is going from an idealism of Connecticut to the reality of Connecticut and when they actually get here. And so the last third of the novel happens in and around Kent, Connecticut.
Yeah. And it's not so far from his memory of what he expects it to be.
No, it's not.
I mean, it comes in and then it turns to fall, and there are some passages you just describe the landscape, and it's what he wanted.
He's taken by it.
Yeah.
He's taken by the mystery of the forest. He doesn't have a forest. You know, he's grown up in the desert, and the desert is itself very beautiful. I mean, I grew up in El Paso, and it is very gorgeous, but it's in many ways, it's literally the grass is always greener in Connecticut. So, and I think one point that I certainly in Tudi's character is that imagination can really propel you to action, and that's what it does for him. Reading and looking at these beautiful pictures of Connecticut in the fall, and he's never been there. He imagines that's my Valhalla. That's where I want to end up. That somehow I'll find my, and he doesn't quite, he has this sort of picture, sort of a lewd picture of this woman from a sort of a scandalous magazine on a wheelbarrow. And he said, but that won't be the person with me. It'll be someone who will take someone like me, a poor kid. And eventually that's what happens, right?
Yeah.
That's the connection he makes over time. So it's really filling in the reality of the real partner, the real Connecticut, the real home that you have to achieve after you go through.
Yeah, and it's back, and actually I was just glancing into the book, it's really back to the connection you make with someone, right? We can make any place a home, but if I'm with you, Sergio, hypothetically, it's a better home. and this connection between them, between two of the characters. Let's talk about something else. We were just talking when you were having that tuna sandwich, and it's something that's come up a few times. We said nicely that they're being chased across the country. They're being chased across some very bad men who do a lot of smuggling across the border. So there's people in Mexico that work with people in the States that smuggle things around the country. Now, not saying what's in the truck, but it sounds like they've done drugs and guns and a lot of bad things. And when you do something against these guys, the outcome's pretty harsh.
Right.
So this idea in the book, and it happens because again, we keep talking about the young people, but there's alternating chapters. There's multiple points of view in the book.
Right.
And there are a few chapters from the boss, so to speak, who is an interesting character.
Don Ilan.
Don Ilan, who wears a wrestling mat. No one's seen his face. He always wears a mask. He's a little scary.
Right.
And he gives instructions on the phone, like, get it done. And we know what that means.
Right.
I've watched enough movies. So this idea, though, and we've talked about this, about the idea of the violence in the book, and you talked a little earlier about thinking about a writer like Flannery O'Connor. Can you talk about a little about your notion of that? Because it's not one violent act. There's a couple, and it does escalate.
Right. And what I do is I never use violence gratuitously. For me, it is very much like Flannery O'Connor, one of my favorite writers, and how she uses violence. If you look at, for example, A Good Man is Hard to Find, which is a very violent story. But what happens when she uses violence in her story? The character is revealed. So I take it as just, I'm a big philosopher guy, like Aristotle. Violence is just another action. It is how characters reveal this. As I pointed out to you, if the roof collapses,
Mhm.
some people are going to run and cry, and some people are going to try to hold it up while people escape, and some people are going to just be frozen. And so, violence is just a way to charge the moment for me as a writer. And so Molly sometimes has to save them and steps up. Sometimes our newsful is the one who steps up and saves them, when these violent characters are absolutely, and sometimes it's duty. And so I take it that way, that for them to form that community, they have to go through a gauntlet, that creating that bond between them, they have to go through real danger, or at least I have to make the reader feel that it's really dangerous. And if they survive, then that creates that bond, that unbreakable bond, because they survived such things. And so for me, that was the reason why to have it in there. But it's also, to be realistic about the drug trade. I mean, an interesting point is one of the main henchmen, John Dunbar, is a blonde, blue-eyed guy who's very respectable on the outside, and he trades stocks. He's in his very fancy car trading stock, and he's the main distributor for the drug lord. And he's also he had ancestors at the Alamo, so he's like the epitome of Texas. But he's not the epitome of Texas. He's really, just making money like anyone else. And an editor, I'm not going to name who, wanted me to take him out. And I said, no, I don't want to do that, because that's actually trying to make a very specific point, which is there are people here on this side of the border that are very far away from being Mexican or Latin American, etc., who make a lot of money off this drug trade. And are selling it to you right here in all sorts of places. And so, and of course, there are some people like Don Ilan as well in Mexico who's just as bad as John Dunbar. But my point was to really give a more realistic picture of how the drug trade functions, at least among these principals. But they're dangerous characters, and they want their truck back, because what's in it is really important.
That's an understatement too. It's more than really important. I want to tell everyone what's in that damn truck, but we won't. And I've read your other work before. This is the first time I've read a stories where you really have villains.
Right.
We were talking when I was teaching this summer. We would just say, how is it fun to write a jerk? These go beyond jerks in a sense. What's it like? Because John Dunbar's in his case, there's a scene where he comes home, and I believe his daughter comes up to him, and she has, the kid drawing thing, and you take an extra beat, and I believe he reads what she wrote, and then he pats her on her head and says, "Congratulations, honey, nice job." So it's kind of a nuanced look at this family man,
and he's proud of her.
And he's proud of her,
Absolutely.
And he's thinking about the future, blah blah blah. So what's it like to write a villain like this?
Well, I believe I love every character in my book, even the ones that are scumbags. And I want to portray them in a full way. And so John Dunbar, although he's doing all these awful things and being a distributor for a drug lord, is a family man. He knows his daughter is smarter than his son, and is somewhat of I don't know if you want to call him a feminist, but he's certainly supporting and holding up his daughter. And so this might unnerve people, but I don't want to create villains that are stick figures. They're all bad, or they're all good, or or whatever. And the same thing with two of the other villains, Eduardo and Chucho.
Yeah, I like them too.
Chucho loves to read poetry, and they're after Eduardo and Chucho are after Turi, Molly, and Arnulfo, and they're trying to kill them. But pursuing them, they're also reading poetry and in a way trying to sort of.
Chucho's reading poetry. Eduardo just kind of sits. He's a big man.
He's a big man.
He's the muscle. But the other man he's just quoting who's the poet? I can't.
I'm trying to remember the Mary Oliver.
So he's quoting Mary Oliver, driving down the highway, God knows what speed, trying to chase these guys down.
Well, one of the things that's happening between Chucho and Eduardo is, I mean, I guess I'm not revealing too much, but Chucho is gay. he knows he's gay. And Eduardo hasn't quite realized it yet as well. And so in a way, Chucho is trying to seduce Eduardo
With the poetry.
with poetry, among other things. And by the way, we did contact Mary Oliver at this stage.
Yeah.
And she said, well, she doesn't ever allow anybody to quote her poetry. You either have to take the entire poem or not, because she doesn't allow any pieces of it outside of her work, because she said it's just standalone. So she said what you could do is just paraphrase it. And so that's pretty much what I did. But I love Mary Oliver's poetry. So.
That I would say that was the subtle attraction, I would say. When you speak about it, I can see it clearer, but when I read it, I wasn't quite on that tune, but they're more complicated than I thought. These villains are yours.
Yeah, and these villains, I want them well-rounded. I want them not just to be, some sort of flat figure who's all bad, because I don't think that's a villain. I mean, a lot of us think we're doing the right things. John Dunbar is providing for his family, but he's doing it all illegally and doing all sorts of awful things to make sure that his little girl, who's really good at math, has a great career in the future. But how is he getting the money, right? Illegally and awfully, and through violence. So I think many, when you look at villains and you look at the best villain, I think they have a sense of humanity in them. And the same thing, by the way, with some of the principal characters like Duty and Molly and Arnulfo. They're good for the most part, but they have their tendencies. Yeah. They have the tendencies that may not be so perfect. I mean, I would probably say Arnulfo is probably a little bit more old world,
Sure.
In terms of his view of women, whereas Duty is not, and that becomes a conflict with them, and I think that's natural. And Molly has her, her own issues as well, but she's generally a good person, and so is Duty. And I think that's what they see in each other. And that's another part of the novel of Nobody's Pilgrims. These are two people from very different parts of the world. She's a white girl from Steelville, Missouri. It's probably not met too many Mexicans at all. And Duty is a 17-year-old from the border who is intimidated first by Molly simply because she's blonde and blue-eyed. She said, in my high school, if you went to my high school, which is 98%, Mexican, you would be seen as the highest of the high, simply because of how you look. And he doesn't understand that Molly does not take those airs on herself. But for Duty, for all these, white girls that he's met in Isleta, they do presume that status, because I guess it helps them. But Molly does not. Molly is kind of gritty and tough, and the other thing about Molly,
they're both orphans. They do have that in common. They're both orphans.
They're both orphans, yeah.
And they live with they both live with relatives that are kind of don't want them there.
Right.
Right. And they have great motivation. Everyone has great motivation to get somewhere else.
Yeah, they're looking, they may not know exactly where they want to go, but where they are is not where they want to be.
Yeah. And they're all in the three kids, they're all in a different position. You have, of course, an undocumented young man. You have Turi is documented, but he's never been outside town.
Right.
And then you said the blonde, blue-eyed American girl, so to speak, who's, in the middle of nowhere.
Right.
She feels that. But their motivations are kind of driven that way. As they get out and they're on the road, they all have different concerns about getting caught and what could happen to them. And it doesn't go well. We won't give it away. It doesn't go well for everybody.
Right. Well, for me, it's when I was thinking about the novel, and this novel was written in a very different way than I've ever written.
Yeah, you said that.
Other novels. I had these characters in my head for years, and everything from what they looked like to how Molly's family died. I had whole chapters of how her family died and how Duty's family died that didn't end up in a novel. So I knew them really well. And the other thing to note, and because I've gotten a few emails from people from Missouri, how did you get the inflection so right? Well, people don't know that for 9 years, I taught in Independence, Missouri, writing to high school kids. So I knew dozens, if not hundreds, of male Mollies and female Mollies. Poor kids who, connected with me because I grew up poor too, and they wanted to tell their stories. And so I just felt that connection, and I said, I want to create a character, a composite of so many of the kids that I met when I was teaching high school writing. And I think, for these three kids, they, when they meet, that sort of working class background, that outsider status is, I think, one of the things that allows them to connect, because they don't adopt an air about them. They don't say, oh, this person next to me, I shouldn't be talking to them because they're different, because they're whatever, they've had torn up genes. And so all of that, I think, allows them to, to create that friendship.
And this is a good example of a novel. I think we always say, write what you know, but know what you write. And it's a mixture of that, right? We all know you're from El Paso.
Right.
You now have a house in Kent. I mean, the line, and now we know your Missouri stop on the way through this thing. But let's think about I'm just curious, when you were a young man growing up, I mean, when you read this book today in our politically charged environments with the border and what happened with the previous administration, it's all right there. I think for readers, you can't avoid thinking about it. Right. And you have awareness of that. When you go back, 45 years or so, when you were a young man growing up down in El Paso, with any of these things, these pressures these kids have, how much did it exist in your youth?
Well, they were there. A previous novel that I wrote, From This Wicked Patch of Dust, is almost the opposite of Nobody's Pilgrim. It's about it, and that's probably mostly autobiographical about my family. From This Wicked Patch of Dust is about this Mexican family that begins on the border, and all the kids adopt different religions, different geographies, but they become American in a very powerful way. And it's about the positive values that Mexican immigrants have that propel you to become, a good American. Everything from the work ethic to this bond of family to, to doing for yourself, not expecting any other help from anyone else. But so that was the positive version.
Right.
And Nobody's Pilgrims is almost the opposite. Next, that was our family. My family, my parents, I called my father our Mexican Stalin because he would work us.
I've heard you say that a couple times.
He would work. Well,
You got-
it's true. Saturdays and Sundays, we would be doing construction work. After high school, 3:30, we would do construction work for 2 or 3 hours. Then we would do our homework. Sundays, we were working. And as I told my kids who grew up in New York City, which is where we live, you guys don't know how it is to work. So I got them. I pushed them in a way my father pushed up, and so these values were very positive, but they're immigrant values. And so that was From This Wicked Patch of Dust. And on the other side, for duty, next door to my family, there were people who were, doing drugs. Next door, there was violence in the neighborhood. I didn't write about that in From This Wicked Patch of Dust, but Nobody's Pilgrims is more about that. I think half the kids in my block, and this is in real life, that I knew died before they were 18, 19, from either drugs or from car crashes or drunk driving or whatever. And my family was not like that. And there were other Mexican families who were not like that. But there were families who were like that. And so for me, it would be false to simply keep writing only negative things about these Mexican neighborhood that is literally a quarter of a mile from the border, or only positive things. I think both things were there. The question is, how do you resist, the bad things even when you're surrounded? And that's what's happening with Duty, right? Duty is in a bad situation. His aunt and his uncle don't want him there, and his uncle is abusive toward him. And I knew a lot of kids who were cholos. Cholos are like basically the gangsters.
Mhm.
And in my neighborhood, and my parents would not let me hang out with
You were
them.
working.
I was working, but sometimes, I wasn't. Yeah, because they knew that environment. But I got to know them. And some of them were my best friends because they would defend you in a way that no one else would.
Mhm.
And my mother, I won't name names, but there was, some very famous, sort of gangsters. And, sometimes we had a ditch behind their house. And sometimes they would be moaning after gang fights. And my mother would pass them enchiladas over the fence, plate of enchiladas, because she would feel bad for them. And they were good kids. They just were abused at home. They were beat up by their dads. And so, but they were good kids. And so because my parents were like that, these kids protected us. They don't mess with the chubby kid who's the reader, because his mother gives us enchiladas over the fence, And so they would, and one of them, a friend of mine, Willie, we were taking Latin class in high school, and I would help him with his homework, and then he would give me little bags of pot to roll joints. And so I would help him I wouldn't smoke it because my parents would kill me, but I would help him basically on his production line so he could in the back of Latin class. But Willie also had a knife in his boot. And if anybody messed with me, he said, "Oh no, he's friends with Willie. He's not one of them, but he hangs out with Willie, so don't bother the chubby kid who likes to read." And so for me, it was also strategic. These kids were kids from my neighborhood. And I felt like if I make friends with them, no one else will bother me. And it's true. And I became and I got to know them as being good-hearted people who had a bad situation in life. And so I think, and Turi's not involved in drugs, etc., but he has a bad family life, but he makes a decision to escape it.
And you've written about Turi before.
A version of it.
A version of it.
Yeah, Turi is a version of me.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if people know, but my middle name is Arturo. But it's not me. It's not, it's not me. But it's,
But there's a scene. What's the story? He's in a short story. What's the name of that story?
A rock trying to be a stone, or a punching chicken?
No, it's a rock trying to be a stone. And there is a scene where he passes food over a fence to his friend Joe.
Right.
God, I have a good memory. To his friend Joe,
right,
who has to leave town and he's on the run.
Right.
So you've kind of nothing is lost on you in the little Rolodex in your head of the past.
No, absolutely not. Because you see one of these tough guys, and yes, the right instinct is when you meet Joe, the real Joe, or the Willie, is stay away, because they will beat the crap out of you if you get on their bad side. But if you knew them, if you knew their families, and you knew how they grew up, and you would see them and interact with them, that there was so much potential, there was intelligence, there was good-heartedness. They just had a bad family life. And the interesting thing is, they saw my parents, and they would tell me this: your parents are better than my parents. And so they would come over and hang around, and my mother would get angry, say, "Why are you hanging around these cholos?" And I said, they don't push any drugs on me. They don't tell me to do anything I don't want to do, and it's good for me. Nobody bothers me in the neighborhood. And so that's what I saw. I saw the goodness in them. And so when I write stories like that, I want to bring that out because it's true.
Yeah,
it's simply true. And just as there was, bad things and drugs and things in the neighborhood, there was also good-hearted people, and also people who resisted that.
Yeah,
who never took a single. In fact, I didn't smoke pot until I got to Harvard. Some preppy kid gave it to me.
That good Harvard kid.
And so anyway, that's true. That
is all there. Hey, there's a bottle of water there if you want.
Okay.
We're gonna have a couple questions. You guys got a few questions, perhaps, yeah? Before we do that, we're gonna do kind of the reverse is the way it usually works, right? Usually the person comes out, and they read a little, and then they talk about the book. But I find this much better. Now our appetite is whetted. We've been hearing about it. It's not putting Sergio on the spot because he has read this numerous times. And maybe he has a short scene.
I have a very, very short, like a paragraph.
Because I hate having a writer and then we don't get to hear some of it.
Okay. So the reason I'm gonna, if I can find it, I hope I don't think I even. Oh yeah, so I found it. So it is on page 219. And I'm gonna read this because I mean I could read the first part and the second part, or is that too much?
We have time. Yeah.
We have time?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll read like a paragraph at the beginning because it's a good contrast. So the first part was, I'm just gonna read the first paragraph. It sort of gives this pastoral view of Connecticut that Duty is sort of finding in books.
And this is what we talked about from the book of the
Exactly.
coffee table book.
Yeah, and this is the very, very first paragraph or two from the first chapter. So Turi Martinez reads a mystery book that transports him to the forest of Connecticut and to the adventures of a boy on a raft on the Housatonic River. But Turi's neighborhood of Isleta doesn't have forest and is surrounded only by the Chihuahuan Desert on the United States-Mexico border. Leaves do not litter the ground like a multicolored carpet as Turi imagines they do in Connecticut in October or November. Instead, hot, coarse sand covers the ground and swirls in the air with every gust of wind. At the library of Isleta High, Turi often loses himself in photographs of New England. Church steeples, like sharp white cones piercing a blue sky, forests, dense and impenetrable, and layer after layer of misty green mountainsides in the faraway horizon. Turi imagines building a cabin deep in a thicket of trees next to a brook where he can fish. He will have to acquire a taste for fish, which at present he doesn't have. He will find a secret place where his Aunt Seferina will never find him and his Uncle Ramon will never bother to look. Turi imagines it will be like a real version of where Charlie Brown lives, with dog houses like Snoopy's and a thick snow in the winter, green baseball diamonds and a pumpkin patches, and a Thanksgiving dinner at a long jam-packed table with red candles. Connecticut is the kind of place where a boy can cut his own Christmas tree in the mountain behind his backyard. Turi imagined in this Connecticut that he will not be alone, yet not with someone like the woman with the big butt in the magazine that Turi taped on the blue wheelbarrow. He imagined someone beautiful and nice, someone still only a blur in his mind, someone who won't mind someone like him. So that's sort of the very beginning. And so Turi has never been to Connecticut. He's only seen pictures, but he's really enraptured by it. And
I
so
will say, those who have read the book have a new clarity with that paragraph about dreams.
and so this last paragraph I'm going to read, it's the other side. They're coming back from something terrible that had just happened. They're in the real Connecticut, and yet he does not give up. And this is sort of the moment of which is sort of from the very pastoral Connecticut to the very real Connecticut that they reach finally after traversing the country in the stolen truck. And a friend of mine who's a really great writer, John Philip Santos, said, "This is your best paragraph, Sergio. You should read this at every." Yeah, but I'm going to read it. So it's page 219. It's just a paragraph. It's near midnight. They drive west on Route 202 through Avon, Canton, and Torrington. The dark, empty streets in front of them are a reflection of what's inside Turi's head. The streetlights mindlessly blinking yellow at corners, no lights inside any stores, no one out anywhere, nothing. The nothingness called to Turi. He'd like to open the truck's door and succumb to the river of glittery black asphalt coursing underneath him. Molly's hand keeps him from doing it. Molly's warmth on his hand, Molly's head on his shoulder, the scent of Molly's breath wafting around his neck, she mercifully asleep. Even Rudy's grim face as Turi glances at him. his fierce eyes that never stray from the road, and his two tears half dry on that cheek of brown granite. All of these images keep duty from yanking open the truck's door and jumping into the night.
It's a pretty good paragraph.
Yeah. So, you know, and this is one of the things, I mean, because my characters inspire me,
Mhm.
and they don't give up. Even as awful things happen to them, they keep looking for friendship and love and connection, and they keep searching for that American dream. And I think if anyone, you know, reads this book and you know, after a very difficult pandemic, and maybe we're not quite out of it, but as we still go through it, I think the resiliency and grit, that for me is something that was very important to talk about and write about in these characters.
That great line of with the brown granite of his face, his softness and his strength. And Rudy, who was saves them really,
Right.
in Kent, in a big way. Yeah. Do you guys have any questions? Any questions from the folks here? We can, we have a few minutes. I have more questions.
So I have questions, but politely, I will allow the people who have already asked questions in our in our Zoom webinar to ask theirs first. So one was, what was the seed of the story? I know you talked about having these characters in your head for a very long time and having, you know, pieces and scenes, kind of whole chapters fleshed out. Was there a particular scene or character the audience would like to know that came to you first?
You know, I think duty came to me first, and his desire to escape the border, not to stay in it, not to, as I've written before in other sort of novels or versions of him, but his desire to explore the rest of America, to find out, you know, New England when he knows nothing about New England, to find out the heart of America. And so for me, it was this sort of sense of, I want to send this character who doesn't know anything about Connecticut right through the middle of the country, you know, to find out what it's about, to discover himself as well as discover the place that he wants to call home. And so for me, it was that was the primary motivation, you know, to get him to explore, this country, because I really do see Mexican immigrants in many ways as sort of the new Pilgrims. And by the way, I talked about this, and I gave a lecture, and this was a little bit of an aside, called the White Fund Lecture. It's given in Lawrence, Massachusetts. It's a very famous lecture. Hemingway gave it, and Junot Diaz gave it, and all sorts of other writers gave it. And it's not the white people lecture. It's literally by a guy named Judge Appleton White, who was a contemporary of Thoreau and Emerson. And he created the Salem Lyceum. Very new, the New England of the old New England. And he created this lecture series. And Judge Appleton White, he wanted to promote free education to people who didn't have a lot of money, and the lyceums were created for that. And so when I was asked to give this lecture, I said, I want to do something. Has anybody ever done this? You know, Hemingway and Diaz and all these people that I love. And so they hadn't. So I went back to Harvard, since I'm a Harvard guy, and I found Judge Appleton White's memoir. And so who was this guy who created this lecture? And so of course I talked about the memoir in my lecture. And so what was Judge Appleton White writing about in the mid-1800s when creating this lecture series? You know what he was writing about? He was criticizing the new English, he was criticizing the established immigrants, the ones who had come from the Mayflower, who were now in Massachusetts, who were now in places like Connecticut, and who were now trying to keep out the new English immigrants and other Irish immigrants coming in. And he was saying, they were like you just have made it. And so what it struck me, of course, was this cycle, and what he was doing in his memoir, and which is why he created these lyceums, which is to educate the newcomers, to, like a public library. When you don't have money, you can go there and read, you can go there and discover yourself.
Mhm.
And he was fighting against what happens when, the first people who came in the Mayflower, they struggled, and half of them died, and then they became established, and maybe some of them become wealthy, and then the new group comes, let's say 100 years later, stay out. And even though they were actually still English. And of course, this cycle happened with Jewish immigrants, happened with Irish immigrants, happened with Italian immigrants, and now it's happening with Mexican immigrants, and et cetera. So it's a cycle that happens, that the new people that get established stay away. Don't come in anymore, because I've got my own. And so I'm not going to help the poor person. And so I thought it was really striking. And I read pieces of his memoirs, and people said, he really was criticizing that generation that made it through the gauntlet, and how they were not welcoming the new immigrants coming in. And so I thought that was very instructive. So it's a cycle that happened, and that's why I called them Pilgrims.
History repeats itself because nobody listens the first time. Questions here?
Just a comment. It's so timely with all the immigrants coming to America and wanting freedom, wanting their dreams to come true. It's beautiful what you've done. I'm really moved.
Yeah, and it's and I am proudly in Kent. I fly the Stars and Stripes, and
Yes.
I'm very much become a New Englander, but I'm Mexican. But the thing is, I know what it took to get to where I am.
Yes.
And it was blood, sweat, and tears, and having a tough as heck father and mother who pushed us to work for ourselves, to care for our families. And I think of these immigrant values, they're the bedrock of this country. That's what created this country. And and for people not to realize that, I think it's a shame. And what happened is, as I told my kids, we've made it. What happens is, your generation, you're too soft. You're going to assume that making it is given to you. It's your privilege. And that should not be the assumption.
No.
You have to fight for it. And so, and that's what happened with every generation. If the parents are successful, then the kids think, well, I'm supposed to have this, rather than I'm supposed to work for it. And I think immigrants teach you that you work for it. You work very hard for it.
Well, it's someone said on the radio, because President Biden has COVID, and so people are afraid for him and so on. Whatever your political beliefs are, he said no matter what, he is not only the president of the United States, he is the leader of the free world, the whole world. He is the leader of freedom, represents that for everyone. So naturally, we feel for him, whether we agree with him or not.
Right.
And it was just a beautiful statement, and I just feel so proud to be an American.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one of the reasons why, I fly the Stars and Stripes is because I really feel like certainly my parents, who were very, gung-ho about, becoming American citizens in the 50s from Mexico, they were very proud of the freedoms that they had here. But they also understood it's something you had to fight for. And even despite, racism and, the doors being closed in my face all the time. I mean, I remember at Harvard, I didn't even know it got cold in Boston. So I showed up with only t-shirts, from like my favorite rock bands, and bell-bottom jeans. And I remember, people not taking me seriously simply because, oh, you grew up poor, you grew up on the border. And so you must not know, you must not belong here. And so that kind of fight you always have to fight. And so it never really stops.
And that's represented in the book too, in the scene with Molly, who's accepted by someone they meet and sees the boys and immediately turns on them.
Right.
Does that happen?
That wouldn't have helped if I had known you were going to give the map to them.
Yeah, right. Do you have another question? We have another question from someone?
I do. I have a question. So going back to earlier, you were talking about having these characters in your head and having them all fleshed out and having backstories that don't necessarily end up in there, but inform your decisions as a writer. And I think that that's very clear in terms of the reality that you present in this. None of the characters have, it doesn't seem like any of the characters do anything because the plot demands it. It seems very much like they're operating in a world, this like making choices that you can understand and that, you or I would see ourselves making. And now you've talked a little bit about the exigence that, brought you to want to include all of those perspectives from people like Dunbar and things like that. So 2-part question. First of all, what do you want audiences to leave with? Perhaps in terms of what, if there is a statement to be made about the American dream or the the revision of that, or how we should be proceeding with that. Is there something you would like an audience to walk away with? And then secondly, sorry, I know that academics do this all the time. 2-part question. As you're including characters like Dunbar and, Chulo and things like that, you also have on the other side of that, the Torgensons and Rudy. And I just wanted to ask about your decisions in terms of balancing characters and including, these like of those latter 2 or 3, just characters that maybe in what is sometimes a violent and gritty world offer like these little rays of light. So
I think to answer your first part, I think what I would want readers to think about in this novel is that to really appreciate the value of the American dream, you have to go through a gauntlet of difficulty, of trials. People who are already here and don't have to go through a trial, don't have to either from poverty or escape violence or whatever these guys have. They'll understand what being a citizen is, but they really won't understand it deeply. When you go through a trial and you go through a gauntlet, just like these 3 characters, you really get a deep understanding of what it means to believe in the American dream and to fight for it, because you actually had to fight for it. And this is, by the way, Aristotle versus Plato. In Plato, right, you had the form of the good and the idea, and it was sort of a mathematical concept. You just had it in your head. And Aristotle said, no. Right? His criticism of Plato was, you won't understand the form of the good unless you practice it. Right? It's not a mathematical concept. You actually have to do it. And that was Aristotle's main. And the same thing here with Nobody's Pilgrim. These 3 characters have to go to the gauntlet to reach their American dream, which is why they deeply appreciate it, because they have to experience it and fight for it. They have to do it. It wasn't given to them. In fact, nothing was given to them. They had to fight for it. Yeah. And so that's the first thing I would say readers, I hope, get from it. And on your other, the other characters, Rudy, the restaurateur in Kent, who's Mexican, who has a good heart and very brave and saves them, and the Torgensons, who offer their house in Kent so that Tootie and Molly can live there in affordable housing. These are people who are in the middle of the US sort of semi-collapsing and evil people around, who also believe in the good. And they seek other people like Tootie and Molly, whom they recognize immediately after meeting them for a few minutes, that these are good kids. We should help them. And so these are the rays of light, the good among sometimes what seems to be a very harsh society. And so Rudy also, puts his life on the line to save them at one point, and which is what you're seeing, this paragraph that I read. And he's unwavering. And why is Rudy like that? Because Rudy's a Mexican immigrant that started a restaurant successfully in Kent. He's been through the gauntlet. He knows what it is to fight for that freedom and to appreciate it and to live it, and then to still have people shut the door in front of you. Mm-hmm. and still you still believe in it. And so that's why Rudy connects with them as well, because he understands deeply what they're going through. So there is a lot of hope in this novel, but I want it to be a realistic hope. I don't want it to be a pat on the back, everything is great. I want it to be, oh my gosh, they went through a dangerous adventure. There were some really close calls and tough stuff that they had to go through, but they got to the other side and they made it. And I think that experience is really what's important for me as a writer.
Yeah, they make it together, I think,
They make it together.
to this ending. You got to read the book, everyone, because it's
I know we've done a really heroic
We're
effort
missing- we're
tonight to
missing-
not spoil it all, and I'm very proud of us both. Good
it's
job.
It's still there's a key component here, but it does happen that way. And it's funny. Sergio, I don't think likes to talk about this, but back in Isleta, where he grew up and went to the library and probably stole books. I'm sure he stole the books of the library. Actually, they've renamed the library after Sergio, and he has book awards. So this notion of nurturing reading of things, and he goes every year and gives book awards to young people who are just like him, who hung out.
I pay kids to read.
Yeah.
So I have the
Great thing.
Troncoso reading prizes, which I give at the El Paso Public Library, named one of the branches after me. And so I fly in December. In fact, I was just talking to them yesterday. So we're planning on when our December festivities will be. And I give 6 prizes to middle school kids and high school kids of whoever reads the most books from September to December every year. And the librarians log in the books and talk to the kids to make sure they actually read the book. And then whoever the winner gets first prize $125, next $100, and the last one is $75 to buy more books. And I give 6 of those prizes. And then I show up and I give them copies of my books. And
Now you're gonna make us feel bad. How many books does a middle schooler in El Paso read in 4 months?
in the last winner of the high school category, I think 35 books.
Wow.
That's impressive.
Oh, they're readers.
That's
Yeah.
good.
And for me, that changed my life. That reading, exploring my mind, reading about Connecticut, on the border, all of those things, just expanded who I could be,
Mhm.
and made me, better at English, maybe better reader, maybe more focused, as a student. And so for me as a father, that's one of the things I did with my kids. I
Yeah.
read to them every night
Yeah.
until they kicked me out of their bed when they were in their 12 to 13 or whatever other room, and they said no more read. But they became readers.
Yeah.
And it's not rocket science.
No.
It's really just practice.
Do you encourage them to write also?
Yeah, I mean they have other abilities, but yeah, they're good writers. Yeah, they're very good writers.
Do you
I was
see?
they also called me the toughest father on the Upper West Side. So
Did you have that emblazoned on some sort of, t-shirt for yourself? That's a pretty nice title.
no, but I love my kids, but I push them just like my father did. He was very, he had a different kind of love. It wasn't just pat on the back, everything you do is good. No, show me a real accomplishment, then I'll give you a compliment.
Well,
And that's how he was. And that's how I am with my kids.
now, do you see it as a Broadway play or a movie?
Well, I don't know. I hope, it'd be nice. My agent said there was some Hollywood interest. So I have 2 Hollywood agents right now pitching the book for a movie.
Wow.
And so if possible, I may get sort of option money. I think that'll probably happen, I hope. And if it does, maybe we'll be shooting a film
Right
Oh,
there.
my
in
goodness.
Connecticut.
Then you're real big, a big star.
How exciting.
Well, the
Coming
35
fall,
books
2024.
I've read in the next 5 months, this is one of them. It's a great book. Thank you, Sergio.
Thank you, Jotham.
Our hour. I want to thank
Thank you.
RJ Julia. This is a wonderful place and everyone should come and support the bookstore.
And everyone
Absolutely.
should buy this book.
Buy the book.
Absolutely, buy the heck out of this book. I'm going to leave them signed in because I love independent bookstores,
Yeah.
and we have to support them because they're really the source of independent voices in the literature world.
So support your authors, support your local bookstores.
Yeah.
Thank you everybody for coming tonight in person and online.
Thank you.
And thank you guys for joining us.
Thank you.